Alright, welcome to part 2 of the weapon system tutorial. In the last one we got it so that you could walk up to items and it will show some text. And next thing we want to do is make it so you can actually press F to pick up these items and pretty much everything else. So one thing you'll notice real quick is that it says interact still, and ideally we want it to say something like pick up. And if you remember from before in our BP item class, we created this get interaction text function. And if you look at it, by default it just returns interact. But we can actually override these functions in the children classes and return whatever we want. So if we go to the BP gun class and we override and we override the get interaction text function, you can see it pops up down here. And we can delete this because this is just calling the parent function. And now we can type whatever we want. So we can say pick up, and you can even put the type of the gun here if you wanted to do that. But for now I'm just going to put pick up. And we also want to override that other function we made for get interaction text attach. So we want to basically tell it where we want it to attach that little interaction widget to. And the place that we want to attach it to is our skeletal mesh, because our skeletal mesh is the gun itself. So we want to attach it to the gun. So we're going to delete this, and we're going to drag in our skeletal mesh and attach it like so. Now, right now, it's not going to look any different in terms of where it attaches, but once we get to the point of dropping the gun, you will be able to see a difference if you don't have it set up like this. So if I click play, just make sure this works, you can see now it says pick up instead of interact, which is a little bit more appropriate for these guns. So that seems good. Alright, so the next thing we can do is we'll actually make it so that pressing F does something. So back in the UE4 ASB character class, let's go ahead and right click and say input action interact. So this is going to get called when the interaction key is pressed, which is just F for me. So the first thing we're going to want to do is when they press the F key or the interact key, we want to check if they're currently overlapping with any interactable objects, and if they are, then we want to interact with that object. So to do that, just grab the capsule component, say get overlapping actors, and for the class filter, we'll just say actor, and then we'll loop over these until we find one that implements the interaction interface. So for each loop, and for each array element, we just want to say does implement interface, just like we did above, and search for the interaction interface, and drag off of this and create a new branch. So if it does implement this interface, then like I said before, we want to call the onInteract function. So drag this guy over here, and we'll say onInteracted, and hook that up to true. And move that over there. And then again, the player is going to be ourself, so we'll right click and say get ref to self, and hook that up. And then at that point, we're done. We don't actually want to continue this loop anymore, so we want to break out of this loop. So we're going to need to change this node. If you right click and you say for each with break, there's actually a special type of for loop that has a break variable. You can see it adds this little break pin down here. And this is the one we want to use because we want to call break as soon as we find one that works. So actually just delete this and move this one in instead. Hook this up to pressed, hook that up, and that up. And the last thing we need to do is hook up this break, and we want this break to hook into here. So we can actually drag this all the way around over here. And I'm going to make some reroute nodes again so it's a little bit more readable. Something like that. So you can see as soon as it finds one that implements that interface, it's going to come back here and it's going to break out of this for loop so it doesn't waste cycles. Alright, so we can kind of go ahead and test this now at least. So if we go into our BP gun class and we right click on onInteracted and we implement function, we can just add a little print string here. Just say hello. Whenever it gets interacted with, just make sure it works. So if we play and we walk over top of this gun and we press F, you can see it prints out hello in the top left. And if I'm not on top of the gun and I press F, it doesn't print anything. So that seems to be working quite well. So let's see, let's actually do stuff here other than just a print string. So when they interact with the gun, we want to do, well, really one thing. We want to pick up the gun. But picking up the gun involves quite a few things. It involves, obviously, attaching the gun to the player, and we also want to change some properties on the gun. We don't want the gun to have any collision on it. We obviously don't want that widget to show anymore. So we're going to break this down into two functions. We're going to have one for picking up the gun, which is going to be the responsibility of this player. And we're going to have another one for changing the state of the gun from on the ground to in the player's hands. So we'll go ahead and write the pickup gun function first. And again, I said that's the responsibility of the player, so it's going to be a function that's in the player class. So if we go back to the UE for ASP character, and over here on the left, we'll make a function called pickup gun. And I'm just going to change the category to public, since it's going to be a public function. And inside of here, we need to do some checks to figure out, like, A, can we pick up the gun? And if so, how can we pick up the gun? Because remember from before, if I go ahead and I run this real quick, this is my other project. If you remember, if I pick up this gun, by default, it gets added to my main slot, which is my hands. But if I switch guns, it goes to my secondary slot, and it goes back. Now if I pick up another gun while this one's in my hands, then the new gun goes into my back. But if I were to run it again, and I don't have a gun in my hand, so I pick up this gun. Why is this not working? Oh, I ran the wrong project. Sorry. If I run this one again, and I come over here and I pick up this gun, and then I put it on my back, and then I pick up this gun, you'll see this gun that I'm about to pick up, it doesn't go on my back, it goes into my hands because there's an available slot there. So there's some logic going on to figure out where the gun should go. So to do that, basically what I did is I created two variables. So go ahead and create a variable, and this one's going to be called primary gun, and the type of it is going to be pp_gun, and we want object reference, and we can just duplicate this one and call it secondary gun. So we have primary gun and secondary gun, so you can have two guns at once, one of them in your hand and one on your back. So when I call pickup gun, they're going to pass us the gun that they want to pick up. So we're going to add an input parameter of pp gun again, pp_gun. And this is the gun that's being added. So the first thing we want to check is, do we already have a gun in our primary slot? So we'll drag in the primary gun, and we'll say is valid. So if there is no gun in our primary slot, then we can just go ahead and set our primary gun to the new gun. So we'll say set primary gun, and we'll right click and say get gun. And of course, this is just this parameter, it's just a copy of it. But if it's not, but if it is valid, that means there's already a gun there, so we can't replace it. Or at least can't replace it yet, because we want to check if there is no secondary gun. Because if there's a primary gun but there's no secondary gun, then we'll just go ahead and we'll put it in the secondary slot. So we're going to do the same thing, get secondary gun is valid, and hook that up. And again, if it's not valid, that means everything's good to go. We can put it in the slot because there's nothing there. So we can say secondary gun and set it to this value. I'm just going to copy and paste. And there we go. So now our primary guns and our secondary guns get updated, but there is this case where we already have a primary gun and we already have a secondary gun. So for now, I'm just going to add a little reroute node and come back to a to-do. I'm going to press C to add a comment and just say to-do, drop gun. Because if we already have a primary and a secondary gun, then if you remember, it drops the gun that's currently in your hand and replaces it with the new gun. All right, and we need to do one more thing down here. So after we've updated our primary gun or our secondary gun, we need to update the attachments in our hands, because obviously if we pick up a new gun, we don't want it to be on the floor anymore, we want it to be in our hands or on our back. So I'm going to create a little function for this called update gun attachments, and just drag it into public as well. And go back to the event graph, oops, not the event graph, the pickup gun function. And we're going to drag this in, and we want to call this in both of these cases, kind of like this, right? So whenever we update a gun, we're going to update the gun attachments. So we can go back in here and fill out this function. And essentially what we're going to do here is Well, we'll start out with a sequence. So hold down S and left click to create a sequence. You can also create a sequence by right clicking and just searching for a sequence and creating one like that. And basically what we want to do is we want to take whatever gun is currently equipped, and by equipped I mean in our hands, and make sure that that gun is attached to our hand. And we want to take whatever gun is stowed and make sure it's attached to our back. And currently we don't really know if the primary or the secondary gun, we don't really know which one's in our hands, because the primary gun can be in our hands or it can be in our back, and same with the secondary gun. So we need some variable to keep track of which gun is currently equipped and in our hands and which gun's currently on our back. So to do that, I'm just going to create, let's go back to the content directory, and I guess we can put it right here in the guns folder. Let's right click and create a new blueprint type and call it enumeration. And I'm going to call it e gun slot. And if we double click on this, we want to add 2 slots, one for primary and one for secondary. So new, and say primary and secondary. And we can save and just go ahead and close that. And then back in our player blueprint, we can add a variable of that type. So click add variable and search for e gun slot and rename it to current, what did I call it before? Yeah, current gun slot. File and save that. So now we can keep track of which one is currently the equipped one. So by default, you can see it saying, okay, the primary is our currently equipped gun, which is good because that's what we want it to be by default. But really what we want to do is we want to drag off this and say like, switch and check which one it is and all that stuff. And I'm just going to make a macro to make that a little bit easier for us. So over here on the left, click macro, and I'm just going to call it equipped gun. And this is going to return to us whatever gun is equipped. And I'm going to make another one very similarly for the stowed gun, like so. So inside of equipped gun, like I was saying before, we want to drag in this variable, and we want to do a select. So if the current gun slot is the primary gun, then we want to return the primary. And if it's the secondary, then we want to return the secondary gun. And we also want to make sure that it's valid, because it's possible that we don't have any guns or that we don't have a gun in that slot. So we can hook that up like so, that up, and of course also we want to return the gun itself. So again, all this is doing is it's saying, hey, which gun is the currently equipped gun, and return that one, and also return if it's valid or not. So we can do the exact same thing, or pretty much the exact same thing in the stowed gun, but we're going to want to switch these values around. So if I copy this and I copy this, we will come back to here in the stowed gun, and we'll hook that up, we'll hook that up, and that up. And the one thing we want to change is we want to flip these around. So we want to flip this to here and this to here. And it's because we're looking for the stowed guns. We want to know which gun is not the current gun slot, or not in the current gun slot. All right, so if we file and save all this, these little macros will make everything a lot easier. So if we come back to the update gun attachment, we can now use these macros. So we can say equipped gun. This is just going to return to us whichever gun is currently equipped and in our hands. And that gun we want to attach to component. And the component we want to attach to is our mesh, because the mesh is our character, as you see here. So drag in the mesh. And we need to specify a socket name because we want it to attach to his hand, obviously. We don't want it just to attach to him anywhere. We want it to be attached to his hand. So we're going to need to add a socket to our character. So let's go ahead and just do that right now. So if you select the mesh, and then over here on the right, you select this little magnifying glass, and then you double click on this skeleton, it'll open up the skeleton for our character. And let's go ahead and change the preview asset to one of him where he's actually aiming so that we can get a better idea. So click preview scene selection and select use specific animation and search for, search for maybe rifle. Let's find one. I think it's idle rifle hip. Yeah, this one will probably work. Or actually, let's Let's do the aiming one. I think that might be better. Idle, or I don't know, hold on. I forget what it's called. Iron sights, maybe. Yeah, idle rifle iron sights. This is probably a pretty good one to use. So we can just pause this animation because we don't actually want it to really be moving while we're doing this. And we want to find the right hand. So over here on the left, search or find the hand underscore R. And this is the bone that we want to add a socket to. So right click on it and say add socket. And we can name the socket gun hold socket. And we can actually add a preview mesh so that we can see what we're doing a little bit better. So right click and say add preview mesh and just add really any of the guns. It doesn't really matter too much. I'm going to use this SK_AR4. And again, make sure you choose the one with the underscore X at the end, or otherwise it's not going to look correct. So you can see this is what it looks like by default if we just attach it. Obviously, this is not right. So let's go ahead and just try to make this fit a little bit better. Now, these animations were not specifically made for these guns, so it's never going to be like a perfect match. Oops. Make sure you have the gun hold socket selected when you're moving them and not the hand like I just did. You want to make sure this one's selected. But yeah, like I was saying, you're just going to have to eyeball this to get it as close as you can because this is all free content. It's not like I had some artist go and make me all these models. But obviously, if this was a real game, you would have the luxury of having, really nice models that were made specifically for the animations that are using them. Yeah, something like this. Obviously, it's not ever going to be perfect when you're using free content, but this will do for right now. You can tweak it better in yours if you want. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. So yeah, so now we have the gun in our hand, and you can see if I play the animation, it will move with its hand, which looks pretty nice. And while we're here, we might as well just go ahead and add one for when the gun is on his back. So let's find his, let's see, I think spine 3 is probably a good one to add it to. So click on spine 3, right click, and again say add socket. And we'll rename this to gun stowed socket. And again, we'll add a preview mesh so we can see kind of what's going on. I'll use the AK-47 for this one. And again, make sure you use the X one. And we'll just kind of move it so it looks like it's on his back a little bit better. Probably move it down a little bit. That looks good. Again, you can tweak it as much as you want and make it, oriented however you want. Doesn't really matter. All right, so now we have our sockets created for the one that's on his back and when it's in his hand. And you can see they nicely move with him as he animates. So where were we? We were in the player. So go back to the player. So now for the socket name, we can specify the gun hold socket for where we want to attach the currently equipped gun to. And we can say snap to target, and snap to target, which will make it snap to that exact spot. And that's the equipped gun. And so we also want to do it for the stowed gun. So we'll get the stowed gun. But instead of attaching it to his hand, we're going to attach it to his back. So we can just copy this. And make sure you hook it up to is valid, because obviously if it's not valid, we don't want to do anything. And hook that up. And we'll name this, or we'll call this the gun, what do we call it? Gun stowed socket, I believe is what we called it. And we'll say snap to target, and snap to target. Okay, so now this function is done. So back in our pickup gun, we are calling that function. All right, so we go ahead and we run this now. It should hopefully kind of work at least. So we can pick up the gun. Yep, so it adds to our hands. And obviously it's still a problem that the pickup text is showing, but we can fix that next. It's probably also not going to work too well. If we try to pick up this gun, you can see it doesn't really go in our hands. And that's just because we haven't really changed the state of the gun that we picked up yet to say that it's not actually a picked up gun. So let's go ahead and do that next. So before we do this to do, let's actually go back to our gun. All right, so in here, after we pick up the gun, we want to basically change the state of the gun so that we can say it is now an equipped gun, is no longer on the ground anymore. So let's make a function called setGunState, and this can be private, so drag it into the private section and set it to private. So we need a variable to keep track of the state, and I'm just going to create an enum for that. So come back here to our items and our guns. So in here we have this enum. We're going to create a new one. So right click and blueprints and enumeration and just call it egun state. And if we go ahead and open this up, we need to add two values. So we want one for when it's dropped and one for when it's equipped. So we'll call this one dropped and we'll call this one equipped. And equipped in this sense just means that it's not dropped. It's on the player, it's either in his hand or it's on his back is really all that means. So we file and save this. Go ahead and close this file. We don't need it anymore. And back in our BB gun, we can click on this and add an input parameter for the gun state. So egun state. And we'll call it gun state. All right, so inside of here, we want to do some different things depending on what the gun state is. So the first thing we want to do is we want to promote this to a variable so we can keep track of the current gun state. So promote to variable. And we'll rename this to gun state. And I'm just going to actually rename this to new gun state so it doesn't get too confusing here. So we pass in the new gun state and we set the gun state to that value. And so this gun state down here that we're storing, let's move it to, or let's set it to private and move it to a private category as well, just to keep things organized. All right, so after we've updated the gun state, we want to do a switch statement to see what the new gun state is. All right, so if it is equipped, so if we just went and we just picked up the gun, it's now going to be set to equipped. So if it's equipped, we basically want to disable all the collision because we don't want to be able to collide with the gun anymore because it's already in our hands. We already have it. So we'll drag in the sphere and we'll say set collision enabled. And or actually, don't do that. Say set collision profile name and set it to no collision. And we want to do the same thing for the skeletal mesh. So drag in the skeletal mesh and say set collision profile name. And again, set it to no collision. And put it up like so. But if it's dropped, so if it's going from in your hands to being dropped, we want to kind of do the opposite. So we want to say sphere set collision enabled. Oops, not that. Set collision profile name, and we're going to set it to overlap all. Oops, overlap all dynamic. And we're doing this because we want the sphere to overlap with things so that we know when we overlap with it, but we obviously don't want it to block the player or anything like that. So we'll set it to overlap all. And go ahead and hook that up. Now for the skeletal mesh, which again is the gun model itself, we actually want to simulate physics on this because if you remember from my project, if I go and I pick up, some guns here, and when I go and pick up this one, I'm not going to have room for it. So you'll see my gun will drop, and it actually falls down, and it applies physics to it. So it's actually simulating physics on dropped guns. So we want to do that. So we want to say skeletal mesh set simulate physics, and we want to set it to true. And off of this, let's make a little reroute node. We'll again say set collision profile name, and we could just set this to physics actor, but I'm actually going to go ahead and create my own collision profile, just so we can have a little bit more control over it. And I'll try to explain why we need that here in a second. But if you go back to the edit project settings and you select collision, you can define your own channels here under presets. So let me open up my other one so I can make sure I have it exactly set up as I did before. So to create a new one, just select new, and we're going to call it dropped gun. That's going to be the name of the channel or the preset. The collision enabled, we want to set to collision enabled. The object type is, again, it's a physics actor, so we're going to say physics body. And we can leave all these as ignore except for, we can leave all these as blocked, except we want to change pawn to ignore, and we can also probably change these to ignore as well. And basically what this is saying is that when the gun is being dropped, so after it falls out of your hand and it's falling from your hand to the ground, We don't want it to collide with pawns, which is the character in this case, because we don't want it to collide with you as soon as you drop it, otherwise it's going to cause some weird bugs. And usually most games, when there's like guns on the ground that you can pick up, you don't actually collide with them, like you can't push them around or anything, so that's why we're ignoring it. And same with like vehicles and stuff like that. Obviously you can change these for your game, but for my purposes, this is what I want. So make it look like this, and then just press accept. And then back in the, where even were we? BB gun. We want to set the collision profile to the one we just created. So dropped gun, like so. And yeah, so one thing we need to change down here is now that we're enabling physics when an item, or sorry, when a gun is dropped, we need to make sure that we disable physics when it's picked up again. So let's drag this over, drag this down here, make a little reroute node. And so in between these two nodes, we're going to say set simulate physics and make sure you leave this false so that it disables it. And yes, that looks good. All right, so one thing we should do as well is we want the guns are in this dropped state by default. So we want to make sure that this dropped code runs when the game starts, because the items are dropped by default. So if we go back to the event graph, we can delete these two, but leave the begin play. So let's drag this down. And inside of here, we just want to say set gun state. Oops, not that. Set gun state. We want to call this function, and we want to set it to dropped. And we also want to do it after we pick up a gun. Why can't I copy this? Try it again, except when we pick up a gun, we want to set it to equipped, right? Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So if we go ahead and we run this now, well, you can see our guns kind of flew out of the ground, and that's because we're simulating physics on them, so it's really not a good idea to have things like half inside the ground. So you want to make sure that anything that simulates physics is, not colliding with anything when the game starts, or otherwise it's going to try to resolve the collision and, whatever. So you can set these to really any orientation you want, because they're just going to fall when the game starts, as you can see. All right, so if we go ahead and we pick this up, you can see we have one little problem here. It doesn't quite attach to us correctly, and that's because it's keeping the orientation that it had when it was simulating physics. So when we pick up guns, we want to make sure that we reset their orientation first. So if we come back to the BB gun, and inside of set gun state, when we're setting it to equipped, the very last thing we need to do is reset the orientation. So there's a handy little function for that. We just drag in the skeletal mesh. We can say set or reset relative transform, and it will do pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's just going to reset the transform of it. And so if we go ahead and we run this now, and we pick up a gun, it goes in our hand like we would expect. And if we pick up another one, it goes on our back. And if we try to pick up a third one, well, I don't know exactly what happened. Bad things happen because we're not really handling that case yet. We still have a to-do there. But you can see the attachment seems to be working pretty well. And the whole physics thing seems to be working pretty well. So we can go ahead and save this. And we go back to that to-do now. So if we go back to the player, we can delete this little comment here because we're actually going to go ahead and attempt to do this now. So let me look up my code. Okay, so again, this case is the case where we already have a primary gun, we already have a secondary gun, yet we are still trying to pick up a third gun. So we're going to have to drop the gun that's currently in our hands for the one that we're trying to pick up. So the one that's currently in our hand is our equipped gun, so we can drag that in. And we want to take this, and first of all, we want to detach it from ourselves, because obviously we don't want it to be attached to our hands anymore. So we can say keep world on all of these so that it doesn't teleport anywhere funky. And then after we've detached it from ourselves, we want to set the state of it to dropped. So we just need to make a function for that real quick. It'll be super easy. Just go to the BB gun, and over here on the left, just make a function called drop. And this can be public, so we'll add it to a public category. And inside of here, we're just going to say set gun state to dropped, and that's really all we need to do for that. So back in the character, let's make a little reroute node and kind of drag it around and set or not set, just drop, which I'll drop. So it's going to drop the gun that was in our hands after we've detached it from ourselves. And then after we detached it from ourselves, we need to make sure that, well, if you think about it, so once we drop the gun that was in our hands, we really just want to call this function again, pickup gun, and pass in the gun again, because it's going to come in here and say, okay, our primary gun is no longer valid, so now we can add it to our primary gun slot and go ahead and update our gun attachments. So we really just want to call this function again. So drag in pickup guns and call it, and the gun is still the get gun, not get fun, get gun, like so. But there is one little problem with this. If we call this function again, it's going to come in here, and the primary gun is still going to be valid because all we did was detach it from ourselves. We didn't actually invalidate this variable. So we need to make sure that we do that before we continue. And again, we don't know which one of these primary or secondary guns is the currently equipped one, so we're going to make a little macro for us to help us out, just like we did before. It's going to be pretty simple. So create a macro, and it will be called set equipped, if I can spell, set equipped gun. And inside of here, we're going to do kind of something similar. We're going to drag in the current gun slot and do a switch off of that. And we'll go ahead and hook that to our input. So if it's the primary gun, then we want to set the primary gun to whatever variable they pass in. So let's drag this over to the inputs so we can make a little input pin for it and hook that up. And if it's the secondary gun, then we want to set the secondary gun. So secondary and secondary. And I know this isn't the prettiest function in the world, but it will get the job done. And then, of course, both of these will just go into the outputs, like so. All right, so then back in our pickup gun function, we can just say set equipped gun. And, oh, we should probably rename this from primary gun because that's a little misleading. So double click on this and just change this to just say gun because it's not necessarily the primary gun. And back to pickup gun. And we can just leave this blank because in this case, we are really just trying to set it to null. So if you pass nothing, it will go ahead and set it to nothing or invalid. Okay, so I think that should be all we need. So we go ahead and rerun this, and let's try it. So we pick up this gun, and if we pick up this gun, you can see the one in our hand drops, and we pick up the new gun, do it again, it drops, and we can just keep doing that forever and ever. We can't switch guns yet, so we can really only swap out these two guns, but eventually we'll add code where we can switch guns, so we can, switch the AK to something else if we want. All right, so I think this is a pretty good stopping point, and I'll pick it up in part 3.